probably the one thing that's most apparent, and and perhaps in many ways most troubling, is that when you drive in any city almost, or any part of the country, you see on the one side, you see these Israeli colonies, these new cities and towns that have Israeli names. And they look like this. They're green, and there's roads are paved, and there's highways, like I said, it's perfectly normal. And on the other side, it looks kind of dusty, not as clean, not as well developed. And what we hear, what we talk about, what we hear, the conversation we hear growing up as Israelis is, we came here and we brought progress. We came back to this country, we the Jews, we the Zionists came back and we brought progress. And we made the desert bloom. You may have heard this. And before us, or even while we're there, you look at these Arab towns and they're just not as nice, they're not as developed. And even today you hear people who come to visit, and they say the same thing. Look how beautiful, look what the Jews did, and look at how backward the Arabs are. Now, one thing that contributes to that is the ignorance. Because the reason one side is green and not as dusty and seems more developed, where the other one isn't, is access to water. All of the water in the country is managed by the Israeli Water Authority. It controls all of the water. It allocates a certain percentage of the water to the Palestinians. And that percentage is 3%. So for example, I have friends who live in towns and villages in Palestine, Palestinian friends, and they get 12 hours of running water per week. Growing up, or even today, you wouldn't dream of not having water running all the time as much as you want. To water the lawn, to water the grass, to shower, to drink, to whatever. Clean water is not something we even think about. 12 hours of running water per week. So obviously you have different priorities. Obviously you're not going to have as much water if your supply is limited. Now, if you know that, then that changes the perspective completely. Suddenly you understand why one side is green and looks like this, and one side looks like it's, dusty and not as clean and not as green. There's another hint that you can tell if you pay attention when you drive around Palestine. And when I say Palestine, I mean the entire country. One of the things you notice is that on the homes of Palestinians in the Palestinian towns, all the homes, without exception, have these massive black water tanks on the roof. You don't see those in any Israeli Jewish home, in any Israeli Jewish town or village or city, ever. Because Israelis don't have to store water. They get fresh water running from the system. Palestinians have to store water because they never know when the water supply is going to stop. And sometimes it's 12 hours, sometimes it's 10 hours, sometimes it's a little bit more, sometimes it's a little bit less. Sometimes suddenly there's no water. Like you go to the shower and... So this is one of those things that you only know if you take the journey. So the journey that I took allows me to know this. Most Israelis don't really care. Don't really think about this. Most people that come to visit the country, unless they come with the intention of visiting Palestine and learning about Palestine, will never know this. But when you think about it, Palestine, and again, just to make it clear, when I say Palestine, I mean the entire historic Palestine, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, from the Galilee in the north to the Negev in the south, the entire country. Palestinians make up the majority of the population. Yet they're allocated 3% of the water. So if you think about that, that's an enormous injustice. Never mind the bombing, the arrest, the oppression, the occupation, all of these other things. Just that tells you what kind of a place this is. And then once you realize this, like I did, you've got to figure out, well, what do you do with this information? What do you do with this now? What does that mean? And again, that was an important step in my journey. And like I said, it goes on and on and on. which is why I call the country Palestine, because it was called Palestine historically, and then one day in May of 1948 it became Israel. And everybody talks about it as though it was always Israel. Like there was no Palestine, or there's no significance to the fact that it was Palestine. And there are all this conversation about there are no Palestinian people and all sorts of nonsense like that.